Welcome to Historical Context's Pivotal Topics. I'm Mr. W. In Pivotal Topics, I take a current event or events and attempt to bring some historical context to them. Nothing happens inside a vacuum, and understanding the history behind what goes on in the world around us helps us to understand our world and those events on a deeper level. This is something I attempt to do in the classroom, and something I hope you'll enjoy as well. Imagine you're a farmer. You make a living by growing crops. Perhaps you grow wheat, or maybe you grow a cash crop, like tobacco or cotton. Either way, you make your living doing something that humans have done since a woman discovered agriculture thousands of years ago. You may use modern tools to farm, but the process is still a difficult and time-consuming one. When you finish your harvest, you sell your crops. You use that money to pay the debts of the sowing process, pay farmhands, and provide for your family. Now imagine that over the course of 3 to 5 years, your farm can no longer produce crops on the scale necessary to keep your farm running, let alone keep your family fed and alive. You rotate your crops, have advanced irrigation, yet the ground is dried up, and the irrigation isn't fed with enough water anymore. You don't understand why a farm that's been in your family for perhaps 3 generations suddenly can't produce enough anymore. It's only a few degrees warmer on average than it used to be. Be that as it may, you are forced to sell the farm and move to the nearest metropolitan area for work. Once there, you spend the meager amount a real estate speculator was willing to pay for your farm in a few months, and there's no work to be found. There's plenty of people, former farmers like you, looking for work, but without the crops and livestock they once produced to process in the factories, bakeries, distilleries, and slaughterhouses, there's no work. Agriculture still makes up the largest single section of most countries' economies, and without it, the economy falls apart. Now imagine you're that farmer, and you watch as your family starves in a 1-bedroom flat you share with 2 other families. What would you do to provide for them? I bet the answer is anything. Hunger has a way of taking over a person, changing their reality, getting them into a place where they can and will do whatever is necessary to survive. Acquiring food can become an obsession for the truly hungry. Perhaps you'd steal for it. Would you kill for it? If you knew that 1 bag of flour or 1 sack of potatoes could feed yourself and your starving family, would you try to overthrow a greedy dictator to get it? The scenario I just outlined would be at home in ancient Rome, Reformation Europe, or 17th century China. Agricultural production failing because of a small shift of a few degrees in the weather patterns of an area, causing a domino effect on the rest of the economy, and with the economy, so goes society. The pattern of weather change over time is tracked by climate science, and the doomsday scenario I just outlined is a reality in many places of the world today. Climate science has become a fairly major bone of contention here in the United States, with deniers of climate change crying havoc about the insinuations made by many that climate change is in fact creating terrorists and making ISIS's job of recruitment easier. Luckily, I'm a history teacher, a science enthusiast, and I have a small obsession with agriculture, so I understand the historical background and science that this argument is based on. Terrorism is, and always has been, linked to more than just religious fanaticism. Climate change isn't a theory in the sense that we don't know if it's true. It is a theory in that it is a developed idea that is still being observed as it is happening. A theory is defined as a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. The climate of the Earth has changed drastically over the course of its millions of years of evolution into its current form. Climate change, whether it is the warming or the cooling of the planet, has drastic effects on the humans that live on Earth. There's plenty of evidence to point towards climate having drastic effects on us as humans, and we as modern humans aren't going to be immune to the problems created by the climate change. History has shown us time and again that the advanced nature of a society does not make it immune to the changes of the Earth or the environment in which they exist. Let's look at the last mini ice age, the Little Ice Age, for an example. Between the 13th and 19th centuries, the Earth was in a period of cooling. There are multiple reasons for this happening: low sunspot activity, eruption of 12 major volcanoes spewing ash into the upper portions of the atmosphere, subsequently blocking the sun via dust veils between 1638 and 1644. The fact is, regardless of the reasons, we had a cooling period. In the middle of this cooling period, when the average temperature dropped by just 2 degrees Celsius in the 1600s, we had some of the most violent times on Earth. This violence was caused in large part by lack of food in multiple places. This lack of food came about as complications of producing food in regions with a 2-degree change in climate. It is important to remember that climate is not weather. The period of cooling brought about more rain and more dry periods for various regions and in various amounts. This cooling led to catastrophic events in the form of crop failures and famine across the globe. Unpredictable harvests in the period led to massive political and social instability. With just a 2-degree change in the overall climate, certain regions that were once on the cusp of viability for a certain crop would be pushed over the edge, and that crop, which would have become a staple crop, could now be very difficult to harvest. Alternately, a change in weather patterns could make regions that had once been dry enough for some crops, say wheat, could now be too inundated with rainwater for farmers to grow large yields as they once did. In Europe, during the time period of the worst crop failures, the 1600s, conflicts based on civil unrest due to food shortages became common and massively influential. The English Civil War and the revolutions of 1640 and 1689 is one example. There are multiple others which I will list for those skeptics out there. Spain's debt crisis and fall from major political influence in Europe. Italy had massive riots from workers and farmers because they couldn't eat. The Ottoman Empire suffered a succession crisis. Across the ocean in the New World, food shortages led to colonial and Native American fighting. In 1642, it was so cold that the entire Massachusetts Bay froze. In India and the Western Middle East, the Mughal dynasties also suffered a problem with succession. Africa faced massive droughts in the Central African region, and in the south, flooding was so severe that livestock could be found in the trees when the flooding subsided. Also, the massively costly, deadly, and ruinous 30 Years' War was fought in this time period. All the way over in China, because it is linked climate-wise, as it's on a similar line of longitude to that of Western Europe, we saw the fall of the Ming Dynasty and the rise of the Qing. In 1641, the Grand Canal, the main artery of China's economy and agricultural means, started to dry up for the only time in history. To fully appreciate the importance of the Grand Canal drying up, you have to understand just what the Grand Canal and the importance of it to China was. The Da Yun, pretty sure I did not pronounce that correctly, so I'm sorry for anybody out there who speaks Chinese. Feel free to correct me in comments. Or the Grand Canal, as it's called, remains the world's largest artificial waterway, and it is the oldest canal still in use. It is 1,121 miles, or 1,794 kilometers, long, and has multiple linked channels. It extends from Hangzhou to Beijing, and is an engineering feat on par with the Great Wall of China. Why would China construct such a massive canal at what was considerable expense? The simple answer, as is usually the case with modes of transportation, was economics. The majority of China's primary waterways run west to east. In order to facilitate trade and improved bureaucratic control over the large empire, the Chinese emperors constructed the Grand Canal, linking the agricultural south with the military, political, and cultural centers of the north. This was important, and the easiest way to travel such vast distances with the 340,000 tons of food that was transported north each year was by waterway. The canal was built in stages and improved in various ways throughout the different Chinese dynasties. According to ABC Clio, quote, suggested dates for the commencement of the canal vary from the 6th to the 4th century BCE. The 140-mile section traditionally known as the Shangyang Canal, from Qingjiang in northern Jiangsu to the Yangtze, probably was constructed sometime in that period and extended almost 1,000 years later during the northern Qi dynasty, when existing waterways were linked to form a single system. The second Su emperor, Yang Di, launched an intensive building program between 605 and 610 CE. He was said to have employed 6 million peasants to construct links between the Huang and Yangtze rivers. By thus joining the north and south of China, the canal allowed for the development of an integrated national economy and re-established the power of the imperial civil service. Therefore, it was not surprising that the canal retained its importance during the Tang dynasty, when China was at the height of its power." End quote. The canal was further improved during the Mongol dynasty of the 13th century, and again under the Ming and Qing dynasty of the 17th. The Grand Canal was the lifeline for China, from antiquity to the modern era. Disruption to trade along the canal could spell doom for a Chinese dynasty, let alone the starvation of thousands of Chinese people. The Mini Ice Age reached its apex in the mid-1600s CE, and China was not spared. The change in climate led to the Grand Canal drying up, which disrupted shipments of rice and other foods through China. This predictably led to riots, starvation, and overall weakening of the Ming Emperor's hold over China. The Chinese neighbors on the Korean peninsula, the Qing, invaded Ming-held territory. They did so primarily because food production in Korea had failed. Upon invading China, they realized that they would do no better there, as the food shortage wasn't a problem strictly limited to their experience on the Korean peninsula, but rather, it was a regional issue. The above events, and particularly those in China, all show that unrest is usually attached to food shortages and high taxes. The French Revolution is another great example of this phenomena. Both high taxes and food shortages are linked to multiple periods of bad harvest due to the change in climate in this period. Why does all this happen when climate changes? Well, luckily math, statistics, and science are friends of ours in answering that question. Quote, "In latitudes north of the temperate zone, each fall of 0.5 degrees Celsius in mean summer temperatures decreases the number of days on which crops can ripen by 10%, doubles the risk of a single harvest failure, and increases the risk of a double failure sixfold." End quote, according to Jeffrey Parker. When food productions failed in the past, there wasn't enough global food trade to make up the difference. It isn't like today where we can ship bananas, strawberries, wheat, and corn to any place in the world at any time of the year. A crop failure in the past meant a twofold, or even quintupling of the price of bread. Bread, despite its demonization by modern first world nutritional experts, has been a staple of the human diet for millennia. But like any commodity, the massive rise in the price of a commodity, necessary for humans to live, will inevitably create a sharp crash in the consumption of luxury goods and services, thus leading to the providers of non-essential services to lose their own income. That's exactly what we are talking about in our scenario with the farmers that moved to the metropolitan center for work. They couldn't find work because nobody was producing luxury goods because nobody was buying luxury goods. And they weren't buying luxury goods because they had to spend all their money on the very expensive food. That's not the worst part, though. The reduction in food output leads directly to even lower food output. Because you have to lower your caloric intake due to famine, the amount of energy you can expend on work, like producing more food, is in many cases reduced by up to half just from a drop in daily caloric intake of 500 calories. Still, that's bad, but not the worst part. Due to the change in climate, the weather behaved in odd ways during these time periods, causing drought when there used to be rain and massive flooding where there should have been prosperous dry seasons. The unpredictability of the growing season furthered the collapse of agricultural systems throughout most of Eurasia and Africa. All of this is an agricultural catch-22 of the highest and worst degrees. Like violence begets more violence, according to Martin Luther King Jr., it would seem that hunger begets more hunger, causing the death rates all over the world to rise. This is the proverbial historical powder keg, and in the 17th century, that keg had been primed with the best powder the climate could provide: lack of food and economic stability for the poor. Ask any overthrown dictator, monarch, hegemon, or even elected government what their downfall was, and the majority would answer, if they could, since most of them are, dead, would tell you that hunger and economic instability did them in. The climate change, which peaked in the 17th century, helped create a world vastly different from the one before it. Lower birth rates, more households headed by women due to massive deaths of men at the hands of political and military struggles, and migration due to failed harvests and economic hardships. So what does this long history lesson have to do with the climate change we face today? It's simple. Climate change matters, and it matters profoundly. 97% of climate scientists and their studies agree that climate is changing and that the Earth is warming. The warming of the Earth by only a few degrees will have as drastic an effect on us globally as the cooling of the Earth did in the 17th century. A few weeks into the 2017 hurricane season, the Caribbean and the southeast of the United States had already seen 5 Category 5 hurricanes. According to the NOAA, there are only 2.5 hurricanes of Category 3 or greater on average per year. There have been double that average of Category 5 hurricanes alone already in 2017. They've wreaked destruction, chaos, and human suffering on an immense scale throughout the Caribbean and American Southeast. As modern humans, we love to think of ourselves as so advanced and beyond the worries of humanity in antiquity, the Middle Ages, or the early modern period, and that those events, which affected them drastically, we can simply think and innovate our way out of it. I don't think climate change spells the end of the human race, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a scientist who does believe that. The issue isn't can we adapt. The issue is how many people will die, how many civilizations will have to fall, and how many wars fought, and how badly will we have to suffer as a species before that adaptation kicks in. The effects of climate change are already being felt. Syria and the wider Middle East isn't just collapsing because of political and religious turmoil. That turmoil is symptomatic of the larger issues that plague the Middle East, Syria included. That issue is that crops are failing. Syrian farmers couldn't grow crops. Many moved to the cities to find work. When they couldn't, because the economy was weakened due to poor agricultural yields, they became disenchanted with the totalitarian regime and saw other peoples in the Middle East like Egypt successfully ousting their leaders. Bashir al-Assad, not one to back down, unleashed a civil war in Syria which led directly to the situation we have today. All because the basis of most economies today is still agricultural, and the Syrian agricultural industry failed because of the 2-degree increase in warmth in that region due to climate change. The seeds of problems akin to those of the 17th century are already sprouting in the world today. It is time for the skeptics who exist mostly just here in the United States, the most influential country in the world, to step aside or turn themselves around on the issue before it's too late. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Pivotal Topics from Historical Context with Mr. W. Remember to check out the website historicalcontext.org, as well as the Facebook page and Twitter accounts. See you next time.